Bienvenidos y welcome a todos to the new installment of Sientate y Hablemos. I'm your gracious host, Nico Gaspar, and today I have...
Valentina Chavarria.
And today is just the two of us. Just the two of us. Hey.
We can do it. Yeah, it's just the two of us. We had our magnificent researcher, Fernanda, do all the research behind the scenes for us.
Yo.
And she decided that she didn't want to come and talk in the podcast, but we really, really appreciate all her work and all the love that she put into this project. So...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before we get into this topic, today the topic is trans rights in Brazil, right? Transgender rights in Brazil. And just before we get into it, we want to give a little disclaimer, have a trigger warning. And yeah, this is also my last podcast, so
yeah,
sad days.
Sad days.
But happy days too, because that means your boy's graduating.
Man, I'm losing my host. My co-host.
I'm losing my co-host
so
at
sad.
the same time too, so
Yeah.
It's
a nostalgic one today.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for everybody who started the podcast in the beginning and all that.
For those who don't know, Nico was actually the founder of this podcast. He came up with the idea and we just ran through it with him. So you can thank him for this.
Or not thank me for this. Like, if it's terrible, you just don't
I
like the podcast.
So.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody who's done a ton of work with the podcast, who's done, I couldn't have been able to do this podcast by myself at all. I want to thank Valentina especially for this year being able to adapt, work with me, and to really set out this plan to make a quality podcast for everybody. So I really appreciate everybody that has been involved throughout these 2 years of recording.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. If you hadn't started this, none of this would have been possible, and we both learned so much throughout the way.
Absolutely.
We learn every single time we make a podcast.
Every
I just
time.
learned how to work part of this, so getting ready to do this without my co-host, but but yeah, thank you so much for this fantastic space.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah,
that's what we wanted to do, was just open up a conversation and have a place for open dialogue to happen and to talk about fun topics, but also talk about hard topics and be able to bring representation and awareness to issues that are happening in Latino America. And I'm really thankful for today's podcast episode in Brazil, and this is the first time we ever talked about Brazil. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, I do want to have a little disclaimer. Neither of us are from Brazil. Our great researcher is from Brazil, and she has given us a lot of information. We also want to say we are not belonging to the trans community, but we do love all of our trans listeners and friends. And we hope that this is an interesting topic and a place to learn for everybody.
Yeah.
And just take care of yourselves and be careful, 'cause this information can also be a little triggering for some people.
Absolutely.
With that being said,
let's get it going. Let's get into it. So to start this, whole egg to crack, one, I don't think transgender rights in Brazil have ever been a big priority or a big thing in Brazil, especially talking to Fernanda, talking about a lot of the homophobia, a lot of the issues that are happening, culturally in Brazil when it comes to transgender rights. So we can kind of crack this egg open at the beginning with the history, and be able to understand kind of the past so we can understand where we're at now.
Right. Yeah. So the history of trans people in Brazil as far as we've seen, has started in 1962, and this is all we're talking about policy and rights and things like that. It started with a thing called Tudo Okay. I'm sorry if I'm butchering this. I don't know Portuguese, but um, um, and it was the first registered LGBTQIA institution in Brazil. And yeah, it was founded in 1962, and then
Yeah, and then 1971 was the first genital sex change surgery was performed on a trans woman in Brazil.
which is truly a historical turning point for the
Yeah,
country, I believe.
absolutely.
Um,
But that's also 10 years after the first registered LGBTQIA institution in Brazil was opened.
right.
So, I mean, it's 9 years, but 10 years.
It's a slow process for sure.
Absolutely.
Right, and so 2004, January 29th, was established the National Trans Visibility Day. So, as we can see, it's slowly progressing. It's slowly progressing.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit, but things are getting better by this time.
So yeah, in 2009, the National Network of Trans People of Brazil was established. And what this was a national institution that represented transvestite and transsexual people in the country. And yeah, that was a pretty big leap forward 5 years after the National Trans Visibility Day was established.
Yeah, and then 2017 we have Tiffany Brew. I'm sorry if I'm completely butchering this name. But she becomes the first Brazilian transsexual player to receive authorization from the International Volleyball Federation to play with the women's team, which is a huge, huge thing. And like, it's just a little frustrating that it only happened 2017. We're still fighting. We're still fighting
Yeah.
out here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then in 2020, most recently, Erica Hilton becomes the first city councilwoman in Sao Paulo, being the highest voted woman nationwide. And I just think looking at all these dates and looking at, a little bit of this history, like a very small kind of portion of it, you see the growth, but also like the change in how fast growth is happening, right? In the very beginning, we're taking 20, 30 years to get change happening, but now we're seeing a 3-year gap, a 5-year gap, smaller year gaps between different legislation getting passed, different supports getting passed, different
Yeah.
so I think that's super interesting too, to just kind of look at how that history is changing.
For sure. Yeah. And not only the history, the rights are changing as well,
Yeah.
which is so important. In 2008, the Unified Health System, SUS, created a thing called O Proceso Transexualizador. This process guarantees comprehensive health care to trans people, including reception and access with respect to the SUS services, including the use of social name, access to hormone therapy, and access to sex reassignment surgery. So
That's huge.
this is huge.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And like the fact that this happened just like right before the Rede Trans, the national network of trans people in Brazil.
Yeah.
It's just like big steps are happening.
Yeah.
Big steps.
No, absolutely. And then in 2018, we're looking at the Supreme Court authorize the trans people to change their name and their gender directly in the registry office without having to obtain the judicial authorization. And if I understand correctly, before that, you would have to go show up in front of a judge, and the judge kind of gets to decide whether you can or cannot change your name or can or cannot change your gender.
Right, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, instead of just going through the registry.
Yeah. So going forward in 2019, the Supreme Court determined that discrimination by sexual orientation and gender identity would be considered crimes. Very important, because even though you're able to come out as yourself and become the person that you want to be, um you could still be mistreated, and you could still there's still a lot going on with that. So the criminalization of discrimination is pretty important.
No, absolutely, it really is, and we continue to see legislation getting passed and things getting moved along in 2019. With the Federal Council of Medicine published new rules for gender transition treatments, expanding access to surgery and basic care for trans people, which is huge because then that also helps them with, making sure that they get the medicine, they get their health needs met. And they're getting that through the government rather than some private entity or something like that. So it's more standardized, more people can get it, hopefully. But we do definitely see a little bit of legislation change, rights being changed, culturally being a little changed. I think that's where we see a little bit less of changes in the culture,
Right.
I don't know, some of the cases that we were looking at in 2017, I guess Debra dos Santos was dragged from her home into a street and kicked, punched, and hit with shoes in a plank of wood. Like, it's still very dangerous for transgender people in Brazil, especially with the presidency that we have now, that we see now in Brazil. And it's a horrifying story. I don't even know if I want to continue to read that story.
Definitely taking steps back, which is very alarming. And this is why we decided to talk about this today.
Yeah.
Fernanda brought this to our attention. And yeah, it is a very important topic to be aware of, and to push for change on these types of things. 'Cause we cannot go silent like this. I don't believe these cases that we're talking about have gotten out of the country's news network. It does need to be out there so we can pressure government to do something better than they're doing.
Absolutely.
Right now.
Because we do have these two cases that have been highlighted that have happened in Brazil. That 2017 case was very public. That when it happened in Brazil, the video came out. A lot of people saw it, and it hopefully sparked at least a conversation, at least some change, at least something, so that some sort of positive progress can happen. Because we continue to see cases like this, even up until today.
Yeah, and it's terrible that this is what it takes to spark a conversation on the topic.
Right.
It shouldn't be this. It shouldn't get to this. And the other case that we are talking about today is Roberta Silva. On July 2021, super recent, a trans woman had 40% of her body burned, on one arm amputated after a teenager set her on fire. So, like, even the younger generation, like, this is not a generational thing. It's just a general...
cultural
just
thing.
Cultural. She eventually passed due to complications, sadly. And this has sparked a whole new wave of conversations on the topic. So, yes.
And I mean, we gotta look at like what is it looking like culturally in Brazil right now, especially with the perceptions of gender, with the perceptions of changing your gender, especially from men going to women, women going to men, like what those differences are,
And talking to Fernanda, it seems to be more dangerous to be a trans woman than a trans man, and we'll get a little bit into this in a second, but this is also the case in the US, I believe, where trans women are more risk due to a very toxic, masculinity driven society that we live in.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I would say is like a lot of the gender perceptions, at least what Fernanda was telling us about, and we see this a lot in the United States as well, is like, and really all over Latino America, is the perceptions and the views of machismo,
Mm-hmm.
and that affects and can have a huge effect when a man goes from being a man to a woman, especially just as a man, when you were told to be, strong and be a man, be a man, be a man, and then now you're like, nah, I don't even want to be a man. Like, I want to be a different gender. Like, that that culturally in Latino America is like, especially in machismo culture, is going against everything machismo culture stands for. And so when that system is trying to be upheld and has been upheld for so many decades, people trying to break that system, it's going to come, that has
Mm.
come with a ton of risk and a ton of danger. And we've seen cases of violence, um and that's a lot. That's a really big and hard change to go through.
Yeah, and also talking about these gender roles from a young age, girls in Brazil are taught to perform house chores in a much more significant way than boys are, and there are there's a significant divide as to what things they have to perform. Uh, they have to stay at home sometimes and help their families, where boys are out there
Yeah.
having fun.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess maybe that's also why some people see it as a threat that trans women, because those gender roles are being um for them modeled, and
Yeah.
yeah, they lose that.
Yeah, modeled and taught and really ingrained into a kid from a young age, what certain gender norms you have to fit in so that you can consider yourself a man, or you can consider yourself a woman. And we see a lot of the things that Fernanda brought to our attention that are happening in Brazil. We see a lot of the same things happening in the United States, where girls are usually thought to be more emotional and sensitive and have more of that weaker side, and the men have to be, seen as this
Strong.
strong, courageous, brave, it all, like, you gotta take on the world sometimes.
Mm.
And like that for both genders is so toxic,
Yeah.
you know.
And sadly, like, this has also reached native indigenous communities
Absolutely.
in Brazil, and like in the majority of the world as well, due to patriarchal practices and the effects of colonization. Um, indigenous women are often discouraged to participate in society, and they're placed then in a vulnerable situation, um, and subjected to discrimination and violation of their rights. And not only this,
Yeah.
but a lot of indigenous communities have a very different had or at least or traditionally have a very different perception of gender than the westernized view that we have now, even to the point of having a third, fourth, fifth gender.
Yeah.
And it's like this beautiful spectrum that just got kind of trampled over by colonization. And trying to go back to those ways now is a process of relearning, relearning your traditions and your history and your culture.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and absolutely, and now and today we see, at least in Brazil, what we were talking about is that a lot of the harassment and a lot of the abuse that transgender folks go through is happening and originating in the home, and that then of course continues on, and they experience bullying and harassment in schools, in public areas, and having to always keep your guard up,
right, and also the increase of trans violence in the
Yeah.
home during COVID has it's been so much, because people can't really escape that anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Or during quarantine, at least.
Yeah, because you're like in the same house, you're stuck together. And I mean, Brazil, had its own complications when it comes to COVID and quarantine and all that.
Yeah.
And that comes down to the political climate. And when we look at the political climate when it comes to transgender folks, is that the current Brazilian constitution promulgated in 1988 and established Brazil was a secular state.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Which is really interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting that it's a secular state. 'Cause you would think that a secular state would be a little more welcoming, at least, to trans people and queer people in general. But that's not the case, is it?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, and so for those who don't know what a secular state is, a secular state guarantees religious freedom. And does not adopt an official religion and does not manifest itself in religious matters unless it's directly involved in judicial questions. And so this is huge because historically religion has had a huge role in, transgender rights issues and trying to control it through the church and control it through religion. And we're seeing here that Brazil doesn't have that control. And so they shouldn't have the church be an effect.
Yeah, it shouldn't be the reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like that's a current issue Fernando was telling us about, that Brazil has a parliamentary evangelical front consisting of Protestant evangelical Pentecostal lawmakers in the government and legislature.
Yeah.
And the members of the evangelical caucus tend to hold more conservative views and have actively held hearings and commissions in hopes of barring any LGBTQ plus rights and women rights as well.
Yeah.
So like, even if it is a secular state, there's parties within the secular state that are still working really hard to impede the betterment of trans lives and queer lives and even women.
Yeah. And we see this especially with one of the members of this evangelical caucus, Damares Alves, a Brazil human rights and women's minister, right?
Yeah.
And this is what she said. This is a quote. She started her inauguration, and that she stated that her inauguration meant a new era in Brazil in which girls wear pink and boys wear blue.
My God.
You're like the human rights and women's minister, like
she's the human rights minister.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah.
This should not be happening. And so if that is the case for the human rights in the trans lives, I don't know. This is ridiculous. She has also declared that Brazil is living through a gay dictatorship, quote unquote. That is her words. That there is, quote unquote, an ideological imposition in Brazil. Those who do not accept it are persecuted. So essentially she's saying that whoever does not accept queer people, gay people, trans people will be persecuted, which to me
goes against what you were just saying.
Yeah, like it seems like she is gonna persecute queer people.
Yeah.
It's kind of the other way around, ma'am. I'm sorry to break it to you, but queer people are the ones persecuted by you.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to tell you.
That's wild. The fact that she could say it was a gay dictatorship, that's just wild.
Crazy.
Wild. And you're the human rights person.
Even more seeing as like the current government of Brazil is everything but gay or queer.
Yeah.
It's actively working against LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's very telling of her.
And when we look at some of the numbers that are coming out of Brazil when it comes to violence in queer and transgender violence, Brazil is the country with the highest number of transgender people killed. And according to Transgender Europe, in 2021, a report of 70% of all murders recorded worldwide happened in South and Central America, within 33% happening in Brazil. So that's
Terrifying.
yeah, exactly. That's in that those numbers right there. That's why we started this podcast. That's really why we wanted to open this conversation and talk about what's happening in Brazil, because those numbers are staggering. That's like 70% of all murders recorded worldwide. Transgender murders happen worldwide, happen in South America, right?
Yeah.
And out of all of those, 33% of those are
Are
happening
in
in Brazil.
Brazil.
So a third of those murders, of 70% of those murders are happening in Brazil. That's crazy, yo.
That's terrifying. And like, this is not to say that we should that if this wasn't happening, we wouldn't be talking about it. It's just it really needs to be talked about now.
Yeah.
Now.
It shows the immediacy of what's going on in Brazil. And especially looking at some of these graphs that are coming out, it's interesting because the year of 2020, when we had like the height of the pandemic and all that, the numbers went up from the year before. Like, the numbers went up. So that means that they didn't even need to go outside to be doing this violence. They didn't need
This
it.
violence
Yeah.
comes from home.
Yeah, it didn't start. It wasn't a pandemic thing. You know, like the pandemic did not stop the violence. If anything, it made it worse.
Right.
Which, you know, in reported in 2020, 175 trans people were murdered, all of whom were transvestites and trans women. This number is 43% higher than the average number of murders, which is 122.5 at the time, which is crazy. Like, it's a pandemic.
It's so much.
Yeah.
It's so much. And it's just disheartening seeing all these numbers and seeing what little is being done to lower these numbers. And like,
Yeah.
I want you as a listener to understand each of these numbers. These are not just statistics. Each of these are individual lives.
People. Exactly.
These are people we're talking about, and these people have families. These people can even have children. They have siblings. They have, just imagine the magnitude of a single person's life in every single one of these numbers.
Yeah.
It's terrifying what's going on.
Absolutely.
So, having gone through all of this, what can we do to help?
Where can we go from here?
Where can we go from here? Protect trans people as much as you can. Learn.
Yeah. And understand what's going on in understand what's going on in Brazil. Understand that political climate, because right now, Brazil is a huge nation, right? And it has a lot of power in South America. And the political climate that's going on in Brazil, the corruption that has continued to plague Brazil, like, we see this, but we don't hear about it. We don't research about it. We don't learn about it. And so continue to learn about that and continue to research and understand what's going on in Brazil. And then understand that even though you're not in Brazil, you can still support transgender lives here. You know, you don't need to be in Brazil to support. You can do that in your own community, in your own area code, in your own zip code, because there's still a community there that is struggling, and there's a community there that you know, needs allyship in some sort of way, you know,
right.
and understand that you're also not the savior in this, though. You know,
right? Yes.
Come in the how can I help, not this is what I think you need for help. Right. You know, and understand and listen to other people's stories, and take time out of your day to listen to somebody else's struggle, and to listen to somebody else's story, understand and really try to put yourself into somebody else's shoe, because that's how you grow, and you start to understand the people that you live around, and you understand the world that you live in, because that's that's vital, you know?
And as you learn and as you understand more and more, be sure to have conversations about it and to call people out when they're doing something wrong, when they're being transphobic. Reach out to nonprofits. We're gonna post resources after this episode is aired so that you can find easier ways to get more information and get started in helping out with this issue. And for the trans people out there, our trans listeners, we love you so much.
Absolutely.
So much. And we hope that you can be safe. We're also posting resources for trans people to get help, for information, for anything that you might need. We're going to try to put as much information out there as possible to continue this conversation and to do our little part in all of this.
There's another little documentary y'all can watch. It's called Bixa Travesti. I think it's in Portuguese, so I might be butchering it as well. But you guys should definitely, check it out. Take some time. I'm a big movie watcher. That's why I always give y'all documentaries to watch. I love a good movie. I learn a lot more like that. And so, just check it out. Take some time. And it doesn't even have to be you need to read an article. You need to listen to a podcast. Just take the time to educate yourself in the best way that you know how to educate yourself. So if that's watching a video, watch a video. If that's reading, read. If that's listening to a podcast, listen to a podcast. But I think that it doesn't matter the way that you ingest it. It matters the way that you you're actually taking the time to take in the information and learn and to take that experience in. And we want to appreciate you guys that have made it this far, that have listened to the whole podcast, and really, being able to listen and talk about and hopefully continue this conversation outside of just listening to this,
Yeah. And so, that being said.
With that.
My
last time.
Nika's last sign off.
Y'all have a good week. Y'all have a good, rest of the semester. Have a good podcast,
Be safe. Take care of yourselves.
Absolutely.
Nico, you take care of yourself as well.
No, absolutely. Your boy's going to be in the big apple.
The big city. So exciting.
Yeah,
Grown up.
We'll see how that goes. But y'all, be easy. Stay safe. Échale ganas. And we'll see you next semester.